Herzlich willkommen and welcome to 99 zu 1, 99 to 1. We have an English episode today, so I'm going to talk in English because we have a guest from across the pond over here. And this is Milton Allimadi. Let me get him in right away. Welcome, Milton, to 99 zu 1.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My pleasure.
So glad to have you here. We're big fans of your work, both at Black Star News and also your African History Club, which is a podcast on or a little show on the channel Black Star. No. Where is that running actually? That's not a separate podcast, right? It's on another channel.
Yes, it's hosted on Patreon, and then sometimes we post it on Black Star as well.
On Black Star, exactly. Yeah. Okay. But yeah, let me get maybe to an introduction of the man, Milton Allimadi. He's the publisher or a publisher at the Black Star News and actually owner of the news outlet, Black Star News. He attended the Graduate School of Journalism at Columbia for an MS, Master of Science degree, where he already is an assistant professor right now, I think, in journalism. Correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yes. All right. He won the prestigious James Wexler Memorial Prize Award in International Journalism at Columbia University. He has an MA and bachelor's degrees in economics from Syracuse University, and he started his journalism career with internships at the Journal of Commerce and the Wall Street Journal. Very interesting. He was a freelance reporter at the New York Times, so we're going to talk a little bit about that too, and a reporter and a deputy managing editor at the City Sun before founding Black Star News. He is the host of the podcast, as I already said, African History Club, that you can find on Patreon and also on the YouTube channel Black Star News. And what we're talking about today is the book Manufacturing Hate, which sadly I do not have a physical copy of here because it was really difficult to get to get a hold of this. So I can't show it in the camera like I'm used to. I read it in PDF format. Maybe you have one there so that you can show the book. Just a second. Yes. Exactly. This excellent book, Manufacturing Hate, and the subtitle is How Europe Demonizes Africa, or how Western media demonizes Africa. Correct?
Yes. How Africa was demonized, yes, in Western media, correct.
Yeah. Okay. So let's get right to it, Milton. Your book is a remarkable critique of Western media depiction of the African continent and its inhabitants. And you make like a broad historical analysis. You go back way, into the 5th century and all the way until today. Looking at, for example, the journalism when it came to the Libyan crisis, to the Libyan war, actually.
Right.
It's quite astonishing, actually, how little work, especially after reading your book, how little work has been done in that field and how little awareness there is that there's actually a huge issue regarding the reporting on Africa, that until all the way up until today. And what you describe in your first, it's a forward, I think, you actually describe your own first experience or first strong experience with that in academic publishing,
right?
And that turned out to be like your main, or one of your main motivators actually to start going deeper into this work. Can you tell us a little bit about this? Like, how did you actually in the end up studying more and researching more about this topic?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you again for hosting me on your show. I think if you speak with any African who's conscious and has not been completely brainwashed and is proud of their African heritage or ancestry, you'll find that at a very young age, at some point, that person realizes that Africa and Africans and people of African ancestry are depicted in a very different way compared to non-Africans. And in my case, I think I was about 12 or 13 years old. My family is from Uganda, but at that time, my family was living in Tanzania. That's when I started reading a lot, newspapers from all over the world, particularly US publications. And I was able to tell that Africans were portrayed as quote unquote less civilized, less intellectually inclined, and just, basically inferior compared to non-Africans. So of course it bothered me a lot, even from that young age. I started writing letters to the editor around that time when I was 12, and I was always protesting at the way, Africans or people of African ancestry are portrayed or presented relative to non-Africans. So that stayed with me pretty much, has stayed with me since that young age. I did not get a chance to do anything about it until much, much later. One of the most disturbing instances was when I was an undergraduate at Syracuse University. We're talking in the 1980s. And I remember in my English class, the professor was talking about Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And it's so ironic. He was reading some of the most demonizing depictions of Africans. There's one scene where the narrator is describing Africans standing along the shores of the river as the boat is sailing, and he's describing them as people that you could compare to people that had been let out of a mental asylum. And the professor was saying, this is one of the best written works in the English language, and praising it. And
that even in Germany, that's the narrative. Like, this book is being praised as one, like, a big piece in literature and such a milestone of even like kind of colonial criticism, while it's
exactly. But I don't agree with that. I agree with what Achebe said, that this was thoroughbred racism. And at that age, obviously, when I was the undergrad, I did not have the knowledge or intellectual skills yet to challenge the professor and say, listen, you're wrong. So I felt I had to sit in the class feeling uncomfortable, feeling actually even intense anguish and pain and helplessness, not being able to do anything about it. So it was not until much later, when I was now a graduate student at the School of Journalism at Columbia, studying journalism, and we had an obligation to write a master's thesis. So I selected this as my topic. So I decided to go way back to see the earliest engagements between Europeans and Africans. And as you said, I went farther back before even the era of the so-called explorers who started to go into Africa in the 18th and 19th century. I wanted to see the depiction even earlier than that. So I went all the way to Herodotus, and I read the histories. We're talking 5th century BC. And he was depicting Africa as a very exotic place where you find creatures. Some of them have no heads, some have eyes on their breast. And then, of course, he also described the fact that people were Black. And he said this was owed to the fact that the semen that the men ejaculated was not white like that of Europeans, but was in fact Black. So this Black seed was the explanation that was offered at that time. And then I went through the different stages where you have all these other scientists also, and learned Europeans, all trying to come up with their own theories as to the origin of Blackness or skin, which of course is very perverse, because it's the other way around. They should have been looking at, but they didn't know, of course, that originally all human beings actually, since they came from Africa, must have originally been Black before spreading to other parts of the world. So they had turned things upside down and saw Blackness or skin as something that was an anomaly that needed a scientific explanations. So some theories were that obviously maybe because of the sun. I mean, the sun, obviously they didn't go and then talked about the need of for melanin to survive in that environment. So they just thought they must have been white at some point, but because they were in Africa, the sun was what turned their skin the way it is. All these explanations, right? And I devoted some time for that earlier period. But then, of course, as you know, I came to the modern era and started discussing how, in fact, the blackness of skin became a weapon used, the handmaiden of exploitation. So whether the exploitation was during the era of enslavement, it was used to justify enslavement because blackness of skin became equated with being inferior, being less than human beings. Therefore, we should not feel that guilty when we exploit them as enslaved people and later on as colonized people. But what I think also distinguished the research was the fact that after I did all the reading, I studied the text and brought it to the contemporary era, looking at how those earlier depictions, because at one point most of the narrative was controlled by the so-called explorers, right? These Europeans who went to Africa and claimed they discovered all these landmarks, lakes, mountains, rivers that already had African names, and they gave it European names. Some of the monarchs. So, for example, today in East Africa, we have Lake Victoria, in honor of Queen Victoria, when in fact it was called Nam Lolwe, an African name, before that era. So they also used that narrative of Africans as inferior relative to Europeans. And why were they doing that? Because they were actually setting up conditions to justify the formal colonization of Africa, which of course, as you know, came later on in the 19th century, the last 20 years, with the Berlin Conference in 1884-85, when Africa was formally partitioned. Each of the major European powers got a specific share of what King Leopold called the magnificent African cake. So they sliced it up like cakes. But then that depiction of Africans that they had established, the so-called explorers, was then inherited by professional journalists, like the ones from the National Geographic, the major American magazine, the New York Times, and then later on publications like Time Magazine, the New Yorker, and all that. And these were all allies of imperialism as well. So one of the earliest editorials, about Africa is then the New York Times was calling for the need for Britain to colonize Africa before Germany did, and also using the same justification that the Africans were not really human beings, they were closer to animals, and said in fact they were more akin to a breed between crocodiles and hippopotami. I don't know what that was supposed to mean, but definitely to mean that they're not human beings like we Europeans, so they deserve to be colonized in order to be civilized. And Britain should do it before Germany did. And I took all this together, but then there was one other missing part. And that missing part was to actually speak with some of the earliest journalists who were sent to Africa. So I went to a major publication like the New York Times, and I inquired as to how I could be put in touch with some of these journalists that had gone there in the 1950s and the 1960s, because I wanted to examine their attitude and perspective toward Africa. And then that's the era before the internet was a big thing. In fact, it was just, basically starting out. And nowadays you can easily look up somebody and get their contact and interview them, maybe, even via Zoom or phone.
Like I did, yeah.
Exactly. But back in that era, you could not. So in fact, it was the librarian that proposed, said, why don't you go into the archives of the New York Times? And because there are many files there about many of the reporters. So maybe you'll find some useful information there. So I took her up on that suggestion. And it was the best suggestion that anybody could ever make to somebody who is a journalist or a writer. Because in those files, I found some of the most crude, racist letters exchanged between reporters sent to Africa and the editors here in New York. And I was able to show through those letters that, in fact, some of the depictions of Africa and Africans in the New York Times were concocted incidents that never occurred in Africa, published purportedly as things that were observed in Africa in the New York Times, including in the 1960s. So, for example, I found a letter by a reporter named Lloyd Garrison. Garrison is a famous name in the United States. Garrison was a famous abolitionist. So he was a descendant of William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most famous.
Oh, yeah. Actually,
yes, he
actually
was
was related.
Right?
All right.
Yes, he was related to him.
Okay.
So, and I say that because then it would not be surprising that he had an attitude that was actually sympathetic and compassionate toward Africa. So one of the letters he wrote to his editor here in New York in the 1960s, I think, I don't have the exact year on me now, but it's in the book. He's complaining about the edited version of his story after he read it in the New York Times. There was a description of Nigerians. He was covering the civil war in Nigeria, the Biafran War, when Biafra was trying to secede from the federal union. And there was a description of Nigerians dressed in grass leaves in his article, something he had never seen and something he did not write himself. So I knew the level of racism, but I didn't know it went to the extent of actually concocting or manufacturing incidents. Right. And that is precisely why I titled the book, Manufacturing Hate. And as I showed in the earlier period, it was not racism as a perversion. It was well crafted in order to justify, as I said, first enslavement, and then to justify colonization. And then later on in the book, of course, I discuss how it became part and parcel and structure when racism became an institutionalized part of the expansion of global European capitalism around the world. So I think this engagement with that material from the archives really brought the research to life. Now, before we go on, perhaps to your next question, let me address one other thing that you had asked in terms of my own experience trying to get this work published. When I finished my master's paper at Columbia, it was awarded one of the prizes that they give to students at the end of the year. There are about 5 or 6 prizes. And my paper won one of those, as you mentioned earlier, the James Wechsler Award for International Writing. And then I was approached by Columbia Journalism Review, which is, I don't know if it still is, not certainly by me in terms of respected in journalism, that they wanted to publish it. So I gave them, the paper, and then I was waiting for it to be published in the review. And then I saw issues of the review coming out, and it would not have my paper in it. And then I finally contacted the managing editor, and I asked why my paper had not been published, and I'm about to graduate now. And it was only then that I find out there was no plan to publish it at that point. And I asked him why, first of all, what happened? And then he says, 2 editors supported publishing, 2 opposed, and then the executive editor cast a decisive negative vote. So I asked, what was the reason? And then he says something very curious. He says there's a feeling that a lot of this material you discussed, these incidents happened a long time ago. And then, of course, this is very perverse. Okay, I said, well, how do you discuss history? without going back a long time ago. So I'm still confused at that point. And then it becomes even much more confusing when I ask to get my paper back.
Right.
And I'm told, and he asked me, why do you want it back? He said, it's been edited. It's not the same as what you gave us. And of course, if somebody tells you something like that, something lights in your mind. I said, that's precisely why I want it back. So I went and I retrieved the copy that they had edited. And then I found out the reason why they did not publish it. They were afraid of the New York Times. And through the years, I found out that there are many people who are afraid of the New York Times because of the tremendous influence it has, number one, and the resources it has. And then number two, because many people would like to be either interviewed in the New York Times or they would like to publish something in the New York Times. So now somebody who went and did research and found out that the New York Times has this part of its history, which it should not be proud of. So people would rather suppress that history. And for some strange reason, they believe that by exposing it, they would be seen as directly attacking the New York Times, which is completely preposterous and nonsense. So how could I see they're afraid of the New York Times? Because this is what they wrote and I'll read it very briefly.
Right. This is quite astonishing.
This is from their edited version, right?
Right.
Recently, the Times granted me access to its archives, including correspondences from the 1950s when the paper sent Bigart. Bigart was a reporter named Homer Bigart. Bigart to Africa on a temporary assignment. After studying the archival material, I interviewed several present and former Times reporters. The following excerpts from the material and from lengthy interviews are not intended as an indictment of the Times. This is them writing without my knowledge.
Not one word from you, exactly.
Not one word from me. Whose African coverage has occasionally been distinguished. This is again them. But as a means of highlighting a problem that all news organizations need to address. So it seems at one point they twisted and turned and massaged the material and were about to publish. And yet at the end of the day, after what I just read to you that they inserted, they still decided not to publish it. I did them a favor. I sent a copy of my thesis to the publisher of the New York Times at that time, Arthur Ox Salzburger, and the managing editor at the time, Joseph Lelyville, wrote back to me and acknowledged that I had unearthed many crude and ugly material from my research. But I also had suggested to them that I could write an op-ed for the Times discussing this research that I had conducted, what I discovered, and making suggestions in terms of how the Times could make right in terms of their bad history, and suggestions for some of the things they could do in the future. So that offer was not accepted. And then for the next 30 years or so, I've been trying to publish the material. At one point, I even published a self-published version in the form of a book called The Hearts of Darkness, How White Writers Created the Racist Image of Africa. But as you know, it's very difficult to get self-published material reviewed, to get it in schools. But I continued improving the research, adding it, making it much more contemporaneous. And ultimately, I was able to secure a publisher last year. And the book has come out with the title that it now has, which is Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media by Kendall Hunt Publishing. It was published in June of this year. And not surprisingly, I have a friend actually who writes occasionally for the New York Times and does book reviews for them as well. And he gave me the name of an editor in the book review section. He said, send it to that editor, and you can use my name as well. And I did. And it's been, I think, probably about 3 months now. Not only did I not get an acknowledgement from that editor, of course, it was not reviewed. I also sent a letter to the publisher of the New York Times with a copy of the book. And this is what I told him. I said, last year, in December 2020, the New York Times did an article about the fact that the Kansas City Star, which is also a major paper, of course, not of the magnitude of the New York Times. I said, the New York Times did an article after the Kansas City Star had apologized about its historical coverage of the Black citizens of Kansas, African Americans. It acknowledged the long and history of demonization, racist depiction, in a long editorial that Kansas City Star published, apologizing for that, and also then proposing some of the changes that the paper had done and continue to will do in the future. I said, given the history of the New York Times with respect to its coverage of Africa, I think the New York Times should also issue a similar apology and editorial. And that was about more than a month ago, going on 2 months now. And I have not got an acknowledgement of that letter as well from the publisher. So I'm not holding my breath. But, you know, now with the technology and the internet, the book is building a momentum of its own. I've had several conversations about it. And, you know, I had the book came out in June, and by October, I already had my first royalty check. So it means people are buying the book. And I hope more conversations will allow the book to gain even broader readership, because I think it has useful information, not only for those who would prefer to continue depicting Africa as somehow lesser human beings, but also to Africans and everybody of African descent. I think they need to also know how some of the inferiority complexes that some Africans have were developed. And I think this book will help open their mind and give them the material that I did not have when I sat in that classroom and I heard that professor praising Conrad's Heart of Darkness. If I had the information that I now had, of course, I would have challenged the professor right on that spot in front of the other students as well.
Yeah, that's a crazy story. I don't even know where to begin there. I mean, this preposterous idea that, you know, these are events that are so far back in the past, so we don't write books about them at face value is so ridiculous, while at the same time seeing the reaction of, or seeing the actual edited version of your paper being a downright, you know, apology basically for the New York Times and covering their asses, showing that is in fact not an issue of the past, but it's an issue.
Yes, it's not. That was a true reason, right? Good point.
It's nearly ironic, and that's why it's even, I mean, it's not funny really, but it's kind of laughable.
Right. And also I might add, I don't know if had I not gone to his office immediately, if I would have been able to get a copy, because because their office is in the journalism building on the top floor. So when I called him, I was downstairs. I went up immediately, and this is very curious. He was standing behind a stack of papers, and like his hand was going beneath it. So he was very shocked when he saw me just come into the office. I said, I'm here for my paper. And then he went to several locations, supposedly looking for my paper, and then came back to that same spot where I had seen him, and then pulled it out and gave it to me. So I now think back and I say, you know what? Had I not gone quickly, I might never have gotten a copy of their edited version, which of course revealed the true reason why they did not publish it.
So, like, I obviously I don't want to cause any trouble, but I mean, one thing that I have noticed too, I have already mentioned that, is that your book, as of now, at least for us here in Germany, is still quite difficult to get.
Yes.
And we already talked about me maybe writing, and I never did that, but I have some friends that can help me writing some reviews for you, actually, for German newspapers. And through this podcast, I actually have some contacts with some publishing houses in Germany, so we can actually talk about that too, finding maybe some way to translate this.
Yes, I think that would actually be the best solution, because one of the challenges in the United States is if a book is not reviewed by publication like the New York Times, then it's hard for it to gain the momentum that it gets on Amazon, for example. So I know you can get it through Amazon, but it would still take a very long time. But had it been reviewed by the Times, there would be no issue in terms of ordering it and being able to get it very quickly. But I think your suggestion is right on point. In fact, it would be very good to get a German version published, maybe even in France and elsewhere in Europe. It's a huge market.
Absolutely, because it's also not, the book is not, I mean, to be clear to everybody else, and we're going to go a little bit more into detail now, but the book is not only about the New York Times, and it's not only even about some particular publishing houses, although you also do criticize them. But it's really like, I mean, what really is astonishing is how you are drawing this red line that goes through history, and how you draw this connection between things that happened like 250 years ago and keep happening today. So that's
absolutely
it was a really eye opener.
Thank
and
you.
To everybody here in Germany, this book is actually right now available at Amazon. It takes a couple of days to arrive. I just noticed this at the beginning of this week. That's also why it's not here yet. But if you want to have it, you can get it there. Let's hope it keeps being available there. Okay. Mindful of the time, let's get a little bit into the weeds here.
Yes.
Maybe we get to your first part. One thing you have already kind of explained, but I would like you to explain this a little bit deeper again, or repeat this for everybody that is kind of new to this topic, because especially the liberal discourse on all things racism, colonialism, has, let's say, quite idealist perspective on this problem. And we consider ourselves Marxists, and we like to look at materialist perspectives. And you also draw like a clear connection to someone that is called Walter Rodney. We also have covered him a couple of times in his great work. So for all people unfamiliar with this topic, could you give us like a short overview of what you take from Rodney's approach when it comes to understanding racism, colonialism, and maybe racial prejudice, but then of course also slavery, and how all of these items are intrinsically and intricately connected to capitalism, and how does this function, and how do we have to understand this?
Right, absolutely. Okay, thank you for that question. So yes, of course, Rodney argued that yes, of course, racism existed before modern capitalism. And I think, just given a brief introduction that I discussed earlier, when, for example, Africa was being portrayed as exotic, the blackness of skin was portrayed as something that's an anomaly, not only by Herodotus, but you can even bring it to the writings of Thomas Jefferson here in the United States, one of the so-called founding fathers, where in his book as well, Notes on the State of Virginia, he's also discussing the origin of blackness of skin. And of course, he was trying to justify the fact that Africans, in fact, were inferior. And of course, he had a vested interest. He was an enslaver. He had plantations. So, and how is it that a very intelligent person like Thomas Jefferson, and there's no doubt he is intelligent, that intelligence comes out even in the reading. So he's finding a difficult time basically justifying his racism, and yet being very analytical on many other issues. And obviously that was the leading now toward modern capitalism with the plantation enslavement. So he writes all these justifications. They were not able to produce great carvings, for example, like people he referred to as Indians, referring to Native Americans, which of course is completely preposterous because he did not have any knowledge. The best works of sculptures and carvings in the world are found in the leading museums today, and they're from the African continent, because that was a bit early when he was writing all this. So maybe it was purely ignorance. They were not able to understand Euclid's theory, for example, and other scientific work. Of course, once again, nonsense, because he was not aware of the University of Timbuktu, right? In what is today Mali, and the fact that they had what amounted to university in the year 900, which is centuries before Harvard or even Oxford existed. But then what Rodney distinguishes is by saying what was very different about modern racism was that it became institutionalized in the era as global capital and capitalism expanded. So now that there was a definitive role for assigning races, and it was not necessarily only black versus white. And in his analysis, he gives a very good example of Guyana, for example, where you had the European ruling class owning the plantations. And he said racism became so specific and tied to one's role in production in the economy that even on occasion, certain Europeans could be categorized as non-white. So, for example, it refers to the Portuguese, who were also brought as indentured labor to colonial Guyana. And they also played a role on the plantations. They were not capitalists. They were not the owners of capital. So they were not actually referred to as white in Guyana, even though physically they were white. They played a similar role as the enslaved Africans or Afro-Guyanese, as well as the Indian Guyanese, who were also brought as indentured labor after slavery was abolished, I believe, in the 1840s in Guyana. So that's where Rodney starts saying the important element here is to focus on the class issue. And I agree with him. But race is such an emotive issue that is very difficult to actually get people to focus on the bigger picture. Even in the contemporary United States, where the ruling class, the elite, the 1%, are able to divert people from focusing on the issue that the system in the United States is not sustainable, given the increasing gap in wealth, gap in income. That is what should be the national conversation. But it's very easy to get people to derail that conversation by focusing on race issues. The alleged difference between Black people and white people. Make that the national conversation and the focus. Racism is such a bad issue in this country. Look at how Donald Trump is fanning the issue of racism. Look at all these right-wingers coming out fanning the issue of racism. And this becomes the dominant conversation on all media, even in intellectual circles. And nobody can sit back and say, this level of concentration of wealth is simply not sustainable. Why? Because, quote unquote, racism always succeeds in diverting that conversation. A very wealthy individual told me something that to me revealed a lot about the United States and about other parts of the world as well. This was unsolicited information, maybe about 8, 9 years ago. He's a billionaire. And I like telling people that he likes sharing his thoughts with me, but not the wealth. None of that has come, but that's fine. But I will take his thoughts. And this is what he said, unsolicited. He said, Milton, there's going to be social upheaval in the United States. Seriously, uprisings. And they're going to try to use the armed forces and the police to suppress it, but they're not going to succeed. And then I asked him, why? Why do you say this? He said, because the system cannot be sustained. He said, when I started making my money, and this, he's almost 90 years old now. So now he can speak, obviously, this freely. So when I started making my money in the 80s, 90s, and so forth, there was a middle class in this country. Somebody could actually get a decent job, pay off their home, send their kids off to college, and retire and live comfortably. He said, that's impossible now because there is no middle class. There's people like me, referring to himself, and all the rest. He said, logically, this just cannot be sustained, and it won't be sustained. So this is one of the elite confessing this, because he's I think he's 88 years old now. He said, it may not happen in my lifetime, referring to himself, but it certainly could happen in your lifetime, referring to me in my 50s, you see? So I thought that revealed a lot. But that conversation will never occur so long as we focus on the issue, the very emotive issue of race. And that is also one of the other reasons why I discuss Rodney's analysis, in my book. So long as the ruling class, so long as those that benefit by exploiting others, control the narrative and conversation, and keep us focused on fighting over the wrong issues, we will have this challenge for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, and all of this obviously is not to say that there is no racism or this doesn't
Of
exist
course,
or something.
there is. And that's the other thing also that I should add, actually. And Rodney said, as a result of this division of a hierarchical role in terms of your role in the production system, in capitalism, there was also, of course, a need to then develop the racist ideology to justify that. And of course, so long as you have that racist ideology, that, he says, becomes a factor in of itself. So of course, we have that, very pervasive. And at the end of the day, that does promote racism, as you said.
Of course, ideology has influence. Ideology can move people, for sure. What I was so like decades ago, I think like 20 years ago, when I was still like a teenager, the first time that I read some books on the first American settlements, European American settlements in North America, how the first slaves in America were actually not all black.
Absolutely.
That there were white and black, and that then at certain points, certain revolts started, and there was a strategic a decision made to actually carve a wedge in between those two groups.
Absolutely.
By using exactly this ideology of race and racism.
Exactly. And that same thing you said also, Rodney, critique in Guyana, which was his country of birth, how the ruling class created a wedge between African Guyanese and Indian Guyanese. And his argument was that they failed to see the common interest. And he gave the example of how when the Indians were brought there, immediately they started hurling racist terms against each other. And his explanation was that you cannot have something develop that quickly unless it was in the interest of the ruling class, which of course it was, the British Europeans in Guyana.
Right.
And sadly, that issue in Guyana is a major problem of today. Of course, Rodney wanted to intervene. He was one of the founders of the Working People's Alliance in Guyana, and that was a very effective multinational, multi-ethnic party, including Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese. But as you know, Rodney sadly was assassinated.
Like so many other thinkers that went in similar directions, challenging the power. Exactly. And I mean, one interesting thing there is then, I mean, if I understand you correctly, these tropes and stereotypes and also prejudices against people of different skin, of I don't know, different eye shape, different physical shape. These were there, and these basically permeate all history. We had that before, and we could see that even from all sides. I think in a way that is not already a power structure, but it's just like prejudice. Let's say. But interestingly, for example, when we had a discussion on the material concept of racism and how racism is an ideology for justification, exactly, we had a lot of pushback from right-wingers who, for example, claimed that slavery existed before capitalism, right? So this idea that capitalism or white people or the Europeans or the West kind of created the idea of slavery is nonsense. Because there was some slave trade by, I think, Islamic rulers, taking actually people from Africa to work in Islamic countries. Now, what do we say to that? Is this historically an adequate take, or is there actually a qualitative difference between what we're seeing
Absolutely
in the Islamic Caliphate and then after in the transatlantic slave trade?
There's qualitative difference at every stage of the change in production relations throughout history. So we had people were being enslaved before the Christian era. We can go back to Mesopotamia. We can go back to
Greece.
Yes, absolutely. Where captives in war were enslaved. We even had instances of that phenomena in many parts of Africa, where people who were captives would essentially be turned enslaved to the communities that had captured them. But there's a qualitative difference. So, for example, in many of those African societies, the captives would actually be integrated in the community. And in many cases, they emerged and became the leaders. You see, there's a very significant difference between that and the type of European Atlantic enslavement and the plantation chattel slavery in what is now the United States of America, where you're confined to a plantation, where you are not treated as a human being. You're certainly not integrated in that community, and you and your descendants are permanently a part of that institution of enslavement. There's no comparison between that type of chattel slavery and the kind of subjugation that captives have always historically been subjected to throughout history. So that's what I would say. And obviously, you find many of this argument because of the contemporary demand to recognize the damage that has done to a significant proportion of the population in a country such as the United States, for example. So by saying, oh, well, even before the Atlantic enslavement, there was slavery going on in the Indian Ocean. So the answer is, so what? Obviously, all forms of enslavement should be condemned, and there should be restitution. Are you saying because that occurred, therefore you're not obligated for reparations here in the United States? That's a very weak argument. That argument, cannot fly. And, if you follow the conversation, at one point, it was a very fringe type of conversation in the United States, the issue of reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans. But that is no longer the case. Now, in fact, I think Congress is on the verge of,
Right.
Of getting enough votes to actually do something in terms of coming out with a definitive position on reparations, at least in the House of Representatives. The Senate is a whole different issue. But the fact is, it is no longer a fringe conversation. And that is the main reason why they always talk about, yes, there was enslavement prior to capitalism or the Atlantic slave trade. But I don't think that argument is going to be strong enough to derail the issue of reparations. And this is the other thing. If the African continent had listened to people like Kwame Nkrumah in the 1960s and formed a United States of Africa, these are the kind of conversations that a United States of Africa could bring, not only toward a country like the United States, but even to some of the countries in the Middle East and the Gulf region, and have this conversation and actually talk about reparations as well. But these countries are having a difficult time even getting a fair trade deal in our contemporary time. So having that conversation is certainly not on the horizon for the time being.
Right. Well, we already nearly hit the 1 hour mark, and I'm mindful of your time. But
we can go a little bit, maybe take a few more questions. And then, as I said, I'm happy to return for a part 2 at any time.
Yes, part 2 and part 3 if possible, and maybe part
absolutely.
4.
Why not?
Let's get to because now we've been basically only talking about the introduction and the foreword of your book. So let's try to get to maybe to part 1.
Sure.
You already gave like a short overview of all of these topics, but I would like you to talk a little bit about what you observed there when you went through Western media and literature depiction up until today. I mean, we can all see that. I think if we just like think back for a moment and watching some kind of, I don't know, war movies that play, Hollywood movies that are playing out in Africa, I don't know, Black Diamond or stuff, or Black Hawk Down or all this stuff. The image and the coverage, the depiction, the subtleties that you notice in those movies always transmit something of backwardness, primitivity, docility. They are somehow dumb. They are savages. They kill each other, etc., etc. Can you tell us how this actually started? Like, how did these stereotypes start out, and why? Like, how is it that they became so dominant?
Yeah. I think that the Tarzan movies here in the United States played a big role in making that such a pervasive issue as well. But obviously that was inspired by the writings of the so-called explorers, people like Samuel Baker. As I said, they arrogantly went there and renamed all these great landmarks. But they also created this pervasive image of Africans as savages, as superstitious, as unintelligent, just different from the rest of society, barbaric. And of course, when it comes to warfare, war historically is the most defining issue. And generally, the representation was that Europeans could not be defeated by people that were backward, unintelligent, savages. So that was the narrative, that a few Europeans could go to Africa, conquer Africa, because there was never any resistance, whether it was the era of enslavement, whether it was the era of colonialism, all false, of course. And how do you create this false narrative? By basically just ignoring these stories. and not given the stories, discussing the stories of African resistance, including resistance to slavery.
All right, from the very beginning. Yeah.
Sorry?
From the very beginning, actually.
From the very beginning. One of the biggest fighters, for example, was Queen Zinga of Angola, who fought the Portuguese for 30 years until they concluded an agreement in 1656. She was resisting enslavement. King Ansa of the Fante people in what is now Ghana, who was in power from 1470 to 1486, I believe. And he had ordered his people to always make sure they prevented any European ship from landing or docking on the shores because they were coming for the purpose of enslavement. So these are the narratives that you don't hear. And then, of course, during the era of colonial conquest, you don't hear the fact that the Zulu actually defeated the British when the British were trying to take over their land and their territory at the Battle of Insandurana, where they killed more than 1,600 British soldiers, which at that time was unheard of in an African country. And this narrative is very important. And you find the media were playing a major role in either suppressing the stories of African victory or ignoring it, and then highlighting every instance when things went in favor of the imperial European armies. So after the Battle of Insandurana, the British regrouped, brought in more reinforcements, and then they were able to secure some victories. And that is when the British then, the New York Times then, for example, wrote a story about that British victory. And I'm trying to find the spot, in my book here. But they ignored the victory of the Zulu in 1879, January 22. That's when the Zulu defeated the British Army. But then later on, when the British came back with larger forces and then they won in July 25, 1879, then the New York Times writes a story. And I'm just going to read a small segment here from that article, and it will give you a sense of what the thinking is. The article was published July 25, 1879. And it says, this is how it begins. Whether or not Providence Hi, I think I lost you for a second.
Yeah, I think I heard whether or not, but now you're
okay,
back.
Very good.
Whether
or not Providence is on the side of the heaviest battalions, there can be little doubt of the result of a contest between a civilized nation with great military and naval power and inexhaustible resources, and a primitive and barbarous tribe, however brave and unyielding. So this is from the New York Times, basically justifying the imperial aggression. And then it adds, sooner or later, the powerful nation was destined to bring the savage tribe into abject submission or demolish it utterly. The justice of the cause had nothing to do with this foregone conclusion. You see?
Right.
So then in my research, I found that in every instance where there was a victory by Africans, military victories, it was either ignored or it was downplayed. And then another instance was, of course, when the Sudanese defeated General Gordon, who was a revered character by the British, and was sent basically to try to suppress a what I would term quite a revolutionary uprising by the Sudanese, led by Mohammed Allimadi. And when he got there, he was very arrogant, stating openly that a European general could never lose to an African, a savage African. And of course, he was defeated in 1885 in the Battle of Khartoum. And then once again, on that occasion, the headlines were amazing. You would find headlines, and I'm paraphrasing, saying the Sudanese treacherously killed Gordon. How can it be? It was warfare. Had Gordon prevailed, the celebration would have been Gordon's great victory. And then perhaps the most famous one, of course, is the Battle of Adwa, when Ethiopia annihilated an invading Italian army. Italy got a little bit late in the act. As you know, Italy itself was basically a new creation toward the end of the 19th century, which of course also shows the arrogance of this new creation going to an empire that had already existed for centuries, talking about Ethiopia. So the Italian army was commanded by 5 generals, and the commander-in-chief, General Oreste Baratieri, had promised to King Umberto in Italy that he would return to Emperor Menelik of Ethiopia in a cage, bring him back to Rome so they could display him in the zoo. That's the kind of arrogance they had, based on the white supremacy notion that European armies could not be defeated by Africans. And of course, they were taught a decisive lesson at the Battle of Adwa, March 1, 1896. It did not last but about 6 to 7 hours, and it was over. The entire army, which included many Askaris, African soldiers from Eritrea, which had then already been colonized by Ethiopia, but also thousands of Italian soldiers. The army was destroyed. More than 2,000 Italian soldiers were killed, and perhaps about another 3,000 Eritreans. About 3,000 were captured. And in an ironic twist, they were marched back to Addis Ababa, which was that time the new capital of Ethiopia. And they were put to work helping to build the capital. So literally the tables were turned upside down. And now you have Africans basically treating these captured Europeans like enslaved laborers. Baratieri himself fled from the battlefield, and he was tried for cowardice because they blamed him. They said, rather than accepting that the Ethiopians were actually brave and able to defend their land, they blamed the commander-in-chief and said he was a coward and he used wrong strategy. That's why they lost. And they put him on trial, court-martial, although he was actually acquitted. And of course, this notion that Africans could defeat Europeans was very upsetting and unsettling. And back in Italy, it provoked riots on the streets and protest, and actually brought down the government at that time because they could not believe that Europeans could be defeated in Africa by an African army. And once again, on that occasion, the narrative in major publications like the New York Times, at one point when the Italians were winning, conquering Eritrea, the coverage was celebratory. I remember one headline, I'm paraphrasing, saying, Italy in Adwa, is this a dream or is it real? And then when defeated at the Battle of Adwa, the headline was not Ethiopia's great victory. No, the headline, I remember verbatim, was Italy's terrible defeat. That was the headline in the New York Times. So
Right.
That gives you the sense of how important it was to maintain the narrative that Africans were inferior to Europeans and could not defeat a European army in Africa. And that narrative is meant not only to influence Europeans, but also Africans as well. So, for example, if other Africans were aware that Samori Toure, for example, in West Africa, was able to successfully fight against the French for 13 years until he was ultimately captured in 1898. If other Africans could know that and understand what strategies he had been using, but the fact that he was able to be victorious, that, of course, would be very inspirational to other Africans who were resisting colonial penetration at that time. The victory of the Ethiopians, if that was widely known by other Africans who were resisting imperialism at that time, that, of course, would be very empowering and inspiring as well.
Yeah, I mean, and one aspect that you also talk about in your book, and that I also came across when reading another book, King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild, I think, was how these discoverers, these so-called discoverers, that went there, like Samuel Baker or
Henry Morton Stanley.
Henry Morton Stanley, exactly, that's his name. How this depiction of African people as, I mean, the sheer fact that they can go there and name a lake as if nobody has been there, is this is not only like how I see it is, this is not only an act of ignorance, like you are not aware that there are other people there, but it's an active act of relegating African people to meaninglessness, to insignificance, talking about them as if they are not human. Even in some cases, I mean, this is not a joke, in some cases, less than animals, less than dogs, for example.
That's absolutely what Baker said,
Exactly. And how this with Stanley, you could see how this was, he was nearly, how this was intricately connected to his standing and his reputation as a journalist, because he was basically the only guy that went into Central Africa for this expedition. And he was the only, or there were like two others maybe, and he was the only one of the 2 or 3 other guys that were sending reports back to Europe.
Absolutely.
And these reports would only be read if they were somehow outrageous, if they would show, some kind of, I mean, like ridiculous shit also, like you were talking about before, like things that are completely made up. And that this kind of profit motive, and also the motive of elevating yourself as being someone special, someone that goes down in history, and someone that will change the world. How this is very much intertwined with all these racist stereotypes that then became reproduced so much. I think one of the funniest and at the same time most insightful anecdotes or quotes that you give in your book is about Samuel Baker and his meeting with a man called Komoro of the and this really shows how kind of unwillingly and probably even unknowingly this guy really exposes himself as a superstitious moron that he is. Can you give us, maybe as a last question before I let you go for today, give us a small recount of this, because I think
of course. Yes, that was actually, you're right, a very remarkable incident, because normally all the stories are told from the point of view of these so-called explorers, them writing in the books were called journals, and these journals were like bestsellers back in those days. And in fact, a lot of the incidents were concocted, of course. When you read, you can tell this is so improbable or impossible. And I also showed in my book that there were some so-called explorers who went there earlier And then they advise the ones who are planning to go that when you write your book, make sure you include several anecdotes about your clashes with these African tribesmen, you know? So yes, obviously, they planned to concoct, and indeed they concocted. But in this particular instance, it's a conversation between Samuel Baker and a leader called Komoro. And his region is now part of the modern state of South Sudan. So Baker encounters him, and he starts asking him about some of their practices, which Baker, of course, finds very perplexing and says, you know, these folks are very superstitious. And he asks him why, after you have buried your deceased, at some point, you exhume the body and, you know, you expose the body. And Komoro explaining, yeah, well, these are our custom. These are the ways that we've always done it. And then Komoro is basically trying to get him to embrace Christianity. And he asked him, don't you believe in mysterious forces out there that control the world? And Komoro says, well, you know, there's some things that he finds, you know, mysterious. At night, sometimes he sees a fire first, but then when he gets there, there's no fire. So these are the things that are mysterious. So it's almost comical too, because they're talking about two completely different things. And between the conversation, which is like, and it's a good thing it was taken as a dialogue, where you would have Komoro saying another thing, and then in between that, Baker also analysis. And at some point he says, you know, he could not believe that he could find a combination of such clearness of mind, in other words, intelligence, in this. In fact, he refers to him as a savage, in this savage, but at the same time, such obtuseness that was not willing to open his mind to believe that there could actually be a God in, you know, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, a God
or a soul
that
or something like
could not be physically seen. You see,
right.
And then, of course, if you flip it around, you realize that it is Komoro, in fact, who sounds like the rational individual who believes in material objects and concepts. While
scientific
Baker,
objective reality.
Baker, who's abusing Komoro as being superstitious, is the one who is trying to get him to believe in his Christian God, which, of course, Komoro finds it very difficult to accept and cannot see. So that's why I found that particular encounter very revealing, and I devoted a chapter to that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also the fact that that normally one of the lines to, of course, denigrate and prove the backwardness of Africans would always be their superstitions,
right?
how they are believing, how they are praying to weird gods and have these weird ceremonies,
compared to objects, pieces of wood, for example, and not equating that with the symbolism of the Christian cross, for example. Yes.
Right. And then the sheer fact that he still wrote it down like this, where that becomes actually so obvious. Yeah, it's quite amazing.
Yes, and then of course the other part is that it was people like Komoro who led the Europeans to those bodies of lakes, rivers, or mountains in order for them to discover. In fact, in his own writing, Baker is asking Komoro how to get to the lake that he then, Lutanzige, that he renamed Lake Albert after the husband of Victoria. And of course, he got credit for that, and he was knighted for that, you know, became Sir Baker. And Komoro, who led him to that lake, sitting back in that part of the continent, never got to know this absurd thing that occurred once this European visitor went back to England.
Right. And I think when he sends him on his way, he asks him, when you find that lake, what will you do? Like,
exactly. Yes, it reveals a lot, because you can see his mind, like, what is wrong with this European?
Exactly.
What do you plan to do with it?
Yeah, exactly. Okay, Milton, it's 75 minutes. I already took you more time than I got from you.
It's been a pleasure.
So thanks so much for your time. And please, we only talked about part 1. We really have to talk about part 2 and part 3 again. So please.
I welcome the invitation. I'll be back.
And be back, exactly. Okay, everybody in the chat, thanks for being here. Thanks again, Milton. Have a nice day. It's, I think, 3 o'clock over there. So your day's just starting. I'm going to go end my day.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right. So, and that is it for today. We are out.
Leute, wir brauchen eure Hilfe. Und zwar als allererstes, folgt uns bitte überall, wo ihr uns folgen könnt. Wir sind auf YouTube, auf Facebook, auf Twitter. Wir sind jetzt mittlerweile auch auf Twitch. Gebt uns
Instagram.
Instagram sowieso, genau. Gebt uns dort einen Follow. Like dieses Video bitte. Überhaupt jedes Video, das ihr euch anschaut, bitte liken. Warum nicht? Ist doch einfach nur ein Klick da. Damit helft ihr uns ungemein. Wenn ihr uns abonniert auf YouTube, klickt auch die Glocke. Dann werdet ihr immer informiert, wenn wir live gehen. Dann könnt ihr dazukommen. Je mehr Leute live mit uns unterwegs sind, desto besser sind dann auch die Views und desto besser ist das für den Algorithmus. Wir haben außerdem ein Patreon-Konto.
Genau. Patreon.com/99:1. Wenn ihr so richtig dabei sein wollt, könnt ihr euch Membership-Level aussuchen. Wir haben 3 verschiedene Stufen. Gibt dann solche Sachen wie zum Beispiel diese neuen Nachspielepisoden, wo wir jetzt die erste gemacht haben. Und ihr habt auch Zugang zu unserer Discord-Community. Weiters haben wir einen paypal.me/99:1 Link. Falls ihr denkt, naja, sind schon schnaffte Typen, aber mehr als einmal will ich nicht zahlen, dann könnt ihr uns da auch ein bisschen Geld schicken. Wir haben tatsächlich inzwischen relativ signifikante laufende Kosten, weil wir einen hohen Qualitätsanspruch haben. Insofern, wir sind wirklich auf eure Unterstützung angewiesen an der Stelle.